I've had the privilege and the honor of speaking a few times at Israel Apartheid Week here in Toronto, and I grew up in Toronto, so I'm glad this is the first place to launch this impressive week of lectures and that have spread all over the country. I just want to say before beginning that this lecture about the siege on Gaza and the background to that could go on all night, because the siege on the Palestinians is the defining narrative of the conflict, and that siege predates the state of Israel and has been amplified and intensified with each passing year to the point where people living in Gaza today say today is the worst day they've experienced, but there's always tomorrow. And that's important to understand, because we're always told that the conflict, we're always told in the media and information systems that the conflict is a tit for tat and a reaction, a cycle of violence, and it's really important to understand that these narratives are reinvented regularly to obfuscate what's really going on in Palestine, and the core of the issue is dispossession and exile of an indigenous population who's been struggling for 60 years to regain those rights. And I think it's important to note that as we say we get stronger, it is important to note that in Canada, it wasn't until the 1980s that Palestinians were actually called by their proper name and not Arabs. And I think it's to see the kind of reaction and turnout that has come all this week, I think it's more than just a platitude to say that we are getting stronger and we are winning. The siege on Gaza, let's just define what we're talking about here, first of all. And this is the core of the conflict, the villages that were depopulated in 1947 and 1948. And those people, which now number 5 million exiles or more, many of whom are living within walking distance of their previous homes. The siege on Gaza and the complex situation in Gaza began for Israel for the occupation in 1967. At that time, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said, "Gaza is the problem. I was there in 1956 and saw venomous snakes walking in the street. We should settle some of them in the Sinai, and hopefully the others will emigrate." That's an important defining moment right after the 1967 war. That was Israel's first take on the Gaza Strip, and it's often referred to in Hebrew as a snake pit. It's also in Israel a way of saying go to hell. To say go to Gaza is is a vernacular for go to hell within Israel. What we're looking at right here in this picture is the refugee situation in Gaza. 1.1 million out of 1.5 million Gazans are refugees. We call them Gazans, but really the Gaza Strip, although it's one of the anchors of human civilization, one of the oldest continuously settled areas, what we refer to as Gazans are really people, Palestinians that lived in what is now Israel and have been driven into these kind of overcrowded camps that we see here today, with population density, for example, in the refugee camp of Jabalia of 74,000 people per square kilometer, about triple the population density of Manhattan. And again, it's important to understand that none of this is new, and I won't quote the Toronto Star too often, so we should take note when I do. But in 1991, there was a front page story, page A1 of the Toronto Star, which was headlined, "Life in Gaza is nasty, brutish, and short." So this is 1991, and the Toronto Star journalist Richard Gwynn, who's now chief international correspondent for the Toronto Star, wrote that the Gaza Strip in 1990 is like a prison. Rows of high fences topped with barbed wire run the entire length of the area. 70% of Gazans are unemployed. Tiny barefoot children play in open sewers. The economy is in tatters. Gazans are virtually dependent on UN aid. And later, it's interesting to note that this is a response to the first Intifada, which captured the world's attention and really began to focus the world's attention on the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And Richard Gwynn quoted that there was an expression of collective punishment going on in Gaza. This is, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Collective punishment that was described by the Toronto Star that, in a perverse way, the collective punishment of an occupied people amounts to a salute to them. those administering the collective punishment are admitting that those suffering it have served it collectively because their resistance to occupation is collective itself. It's important to understand this juxtaposition because what we see here at the top of this photograph is Israel, and at the bottom is Gaza. And people can see that concrete fence that surrounds Gaza. It's important to understand that if you only take one thing from the presentation that I give today, it's to really understand that the Gaza Strip is the model for the West Bank. And so what we're seeing in Gaza today is really the defining element of the next generation of the conflict, the ghettoization of the Palestinian population, and then, as we've seen with Hillary Clinton, her visits in Cairo, the idea is that these ghettos will become the two-state solution. So that's important to understand. So Gaza is the model. What we see in Gaza is not a one-off, but something that we can expect to happen throughout the West Bank. And if people have seen the wall in the West Bank, the separation barrier, apartheid wall, it looks identical to what surrounds Gaza. And the process in the West Bank is similar to how it was in Gaza, and that is after the peace process began, the so-called peace process, Oslo peace process in the early 1990s, when Israel began to see that, that a Palestinian state was on the international agenda and was moving forward, Israel sought to contain that area, particularly through a process of checkpoints, which have come to define the occupation, of course, in the West Bank, more than 600 roadblocks and obstacles in the West Bank. So the Gaza Strip, which was at the time open, was gradually closed, first principally through the use of checkpoints, and then with the physical walling off of that area. So the siege on Gaza, which often is framed as beginning with Hamas, with the election of Hamas in 2006, of course, long predates that. And just before the disengagement, the World Bank described, hardly a friend of the Palestinians, the World Bank described the situation in the West Bank and Gaza as, quote, the greatest collapse in modern history, greatest economic collapse in modern history, and they attributed that collapse to the siege on the Palestinians and the closure regime that dominates life for Palestinians. My pictures aren't going to sync up with my presentation exactly, so people can just use these photographs to understand what we're looking at every day in Gaza. A house like this, it's important to remember when we talk about tit for tat. A house like this is defining in Gaza, and it's something that takes place over the course of many years and is not a reaction to one event or another, but a constant suppression of the Palestinians through these kind of violent attacks. The Intifada, I'm going to skip ahead to the Intifada that began in October 2003, and understand that that process is what brought about what I'm going to discuss today, which is the disengagement plan, the formalization of the ghettoization plan in the West Bank and Gaza, referred to with the common phrase disengagement, which was a term that has no legal grounding, and it was an important term for Israel to make up because the conventional term that was thrown around was withdrawal. But what happened in Gaza in 2005 was not a withdrawal, but rather a redeployment of forces. And so the disengagement is these kind of words that are used to sanitize what's really going on. It came about particularly was launched by Ehud Olmert in an interview in the fall of 2003, in November of 2003 with Haaretz, the leading liberal Israeli daily. And Olmert at the time was Sharon's leading portfolio holder and key deputy. And so it was his job to float the idea of the disengagement, to float the idea to the Israeli population and get them used to the idea that this is what was coming. And so in this interview, which can be found interestingly enough under the headline, Maximum Jews, Minimum Arabs, was an interview with the editor of Haaretz in which Ehud Olmert said that the quote-unquote demographic bomb, the idea that the Palestinian birth rate and the population between Arabs and Jews in Palestine was a threat to the Israeli state, which Olmert said, quote, had to be dealt with the utmost seriousness. And it's important for Apartheid Week to frame the conflict in terms of what Ehud Olmert described, which was, he said, a fundamental shift from what he called the South African model, from the Algerian model, which of national liberation, to the South African model. And that's an important point, because the South African model he described as one person, one vote, versus the Algerian model, which was the indigenous population attempting to expel an occupier. Now, Elmer said that the South African model was a much cleaner struggle, a much more powerful struggle, and ultimately a struggle that would mean the end of the Jewish state. And so in this interview, Maximum Jews, Minimum Arabs, Elmer describes how the withdrawal from Gaza, where there was 6,000 Jewish settlers and 1.5 million Palestinians, was crucial to this demographic protection, and that the wall, the program of the apartheid wall, was the crucial anchor of the disengagement plan. And so while the disengagement plan is talked about now as history, it's important to note that the wall was the beginning of the disengagement plan, and the wall itself, although almost complete, is not. Ariel Sharon then gave a speech a month later to the Israeli public in December of 2003, and he stood before the Israeli population on a televised speech that was watched by the nation, in which he began by saying that Israel had a dream, but it could not be implemented. And the idea of this is that the dream is all of Palestine, all of historical Palestine from the Jordan River to the sea. That's the Zionist dream, to control that area as an overwhelmingly, if not homogenous, Jewish state. So Sharon said this dream could not be implemented. Doug Weisglass, who is the Karl Rove, if you will, to Ariel Sharon, the key advisor to Sharon, and ultimately then to Olmert, and then ultimately to Tzipi Livni, although she's described in the Canadian media now as a moderate, and I even heard Jon Stewart call her a leftist. It's important to understand that Doug Weisglass and his crew are the people behind the scenes for these leaders. Now, Doug Weisglass gave a very important interview in which he called the disengagement plan the formaldehyde solution. The idea being the disengagement plan postponed the peace process by 25 years, Doug Weisglass said. And it was crucial in understanding that the United States backed this plan with votes in the Senate and the House that ran 405 to 5 and 95 to 5, in giving people an idea of just how across the House in the United States there's virtually unanimous support for this program of ghettoization of the Palestinians. So Doug Weisglass, he explains why the disengagement comes about, and largely he explains it comes about because of Palestinian resistance. It comes about because of the Intifada, and because of the increase in a drive for a Palestinian state and the increase in the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. This is how he described it. He said, in the fall of 2003, we understood that everything was stuck. Even though, according to the American reading of the situation, the blame fell on the Palestinians and not us, Sharon grasped that this state of affairs would not last, that they wouldn't leave us alone, they wouldn't get off our case. Time was not on our side. There was an international erosion as well as an internal erosion. Domestically, in the meantime, everything was collapsing. The economy was stagnant. The Geneva Initiative had garnered broad support. In other words, a peace proposal had garnered broad support. And we were hit with letters by officers and pilots, letters of commandos, refusing to serve in the occupied territories. These were not weird kids with green ponytails and a ring in their nose who gave off a strong odor of grass. These were the people these were Specter's group, the people were our finest young people. And so there's a crisis within Israel as a result of the Palestinian uprising, and this is Israel's attempt to postpone the drive towards a state which the Palestinian resistance had put on the table throughout the Intifada, and the Palestinian population itself had put on the table through the Intifada, through their collective action. So after announcing the disengagement, it's crucial to understand that the landscape in Gaza was prepared for Israel's withdrawal. And I say that through a number of different ways. First and foremost, Israel carried out key assassinations of the top Hamas leadership. Now, people were surprised, Condoleezza Rice, etc., were surprised in 2006 when Hamas won the election, but anytime, anyone who had visited Gaza before that, it was clear that Hamas was a powerful movement within Gaza and in many ways controlled what was going on in the Gaza Strip. And it was important for Israel to prepare the landscape by assassinating the top leadership, which they did 1 month after announcing the disengagement officially with the assassinations of Sheikh Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi. Sheikh Yassin, it's important to understand that throughout the 1990s, as Israel was carrying out its Oslo process, which was described by the chief negotiator of the Oslo peace process as creating a situation of permanent neo-colonial dependency. During this time, the collaborationist security forces of the Palestinians were targeting Hamas for arrest, torture, and during this time, Sheikh Yassin made it so that Hamas refused to fight back to this provocation by these collaborationist forces, and saying famously that Hamas would never lift its hand against its brothers. It's important to understand that in the context of the Hamas-Fatah conflict, which there won't be any time to discuss, but if people want to bring it up in the question and answer period. This kind of leadership that could bring the Palestinians together was assassinated as part of a long-term Israeli policy that they describe as pulling from the roots. That is bringing down the national liberation struggle by assassinating not what we hear of as ticking time bombs, but as the key political and intellectual leadership of the national liberation movement. And Yassin and Rantisi can be seen in this light. And Sharon described these assassinations as a great achievement and a crucial part of laying the foundation of the disengagement plan. The other processes that went on were widespread demolitions, house demolitions, and the creation of what are called buffer zones along in southern Rafah, along the Philadelphia corridor, and in the north as well. The idea being bulldoze the Palestinian refugee camps on the edge of the borders with Gaza to push back the Palestinians away from the border so that Israel could police that border once they withdrew. So the landscape was prepared, the siege was prepared, and the war that we saw in the last month was long unfolding. And in the period of the demolitions, there was 4 major incursions into Gaza, which killed hundreds of people at that time, each one progressively worse than the next. And of course, this last one that we saw in December, the worst of them all. So the targeting, I want to just describe a couple of these pictures because those previous pictures of the targeting of the schools, it's important to understand that the war goes on all aspects of Palestinian life during this period of time. So it's not simply a political process, and Layla will talk more about that, but it's pictures like this that describe what happens to the Palestinians after their houses get destroyed, after their schools get attacked, this kind of resolute continuation of their education, continuation of their development as a national movement in the face of these kind of attacks are what creates the crisis for Israel in the first place. The fact that the Palestinian situation, unlike what Levi Eshkol hoped for in 1967, that the Palestinians were not going to flee, were not going to give in, and that the struggle was going to continue. And I think in many cases a photograph like this describes that better than any lecture really could. The siege on Gaza, which had gone on long before, was a targeting of the fundamental apparatuses of life. So this is fishing off the shoreline because Palestinian fishing boats that went out to sea faced this kind of reaction from the Israelis. As you can see, boats targeted. And so a fundamental aspect of life in this coastal area is undermined by denying them access to the sea, but more crucially, with a refugee population, 80% of whom are living on $2 a day, people were denied the fundamentals of daily survival. with fish protein making up a considerable amount of the animal protein in the diet of Gaza, which the World Food Program said was going to lead to acute levels of malnutrition. These studies are just now emerging because of the time it takes to get the proper scientific data on how these starvation policies affect people day to day. This is a photograph of that describes something that Israel did immediately after the disengagement, which was the targeting of the power plants in Gaza and the creation of a situation where Palestinians couldn't rely on the most elementary needs of life. There's no roving blackouts, but rather virtually a permanent situation of blackout with occasional amounts of electricity that balance what is otherwise darkness. And this has impacts all across the Palestinian spectrum, including when you don't have power, the sewage doesn't work properly, flooding areas, as the Toronto Star described 20 years earlier. And this system of checkpoints that began in the Gaza Strip is important to understand the model for the West Bank, as I said. So the apparatus has a long history, and in the West Bank itself, we can see how the wall creates a dynamic of creating miniature Gazas throughout the West Bank. And this map, which was probably better at the beginning when you walked in with the reverse colors, really shows the idea of how these are set up. And the map on the right here, 2003, is actually probably a generous rendering of the situation. The actual islands in the north, there's actually probably 3 islands in the north as Ariel cuts through, dividing the West Bank into 4 major parts, and in those parts are smaller parts, which you can see through a map like this. The Israelis, maximum Jews, minimum Arabs, as Ehud Olmert said. The idea of bringing the maximum number of Israeli settlements within to the state of Israel for this. Okay, let me just take one step back and say Israel is the only state in the world without borders. All of its borders are armistice lines mediated by the United Nations. And so this disengagement process is Israel's first, after 60 years, first attempt to define its borders. And in doing so, of course, was very upsetting for many of the settler population. When I traveled in the West Bank, one settler famously told me that he didn't want the wall because why would you build a wall, he said, through your living room? And this was the kind of idea, this was the dream that Sharon was talking about that had been undermined and had to be readapted. Now I want you to focus on Qalqilia in about 2/3 of the way up. And you can see that the Q in Qalqilia doesn't even fit within this miniature Gaza model. And if you look at a picture like this, a much more closely photographed or mapped area, you can see just how ridiculous the ghetto apparatus is in order to bring one settlement within Israel. Now, Alfie Menashe is a very important settlement for the disengagement process. It was in this settlement that Sharon unfolded a map on Israeli television and pointed out the importance of the wall in the model, the importance of the wall for, as they said, for Israeli security. And you can see just how it isolates and creates these miniature ghettos all throughout. Qalqilia is the first of the West Bank ghettos. It's completely surrounded and has been since 2004. And you can see it's not a wall. The wall is not a border, but it's weaving in and out, grabbing each particular piece of land, in this case grabbing one tree. And inside that wall is another wall, a security fence, with these kind of friendly warnings with a sniper tower in the background. Now this is within the village of Qalqilia, so if you're sitting at your dinner table looking out at the wall, that's what you see as a reminder. Now in terms of the disengagement plan, there was a very important exchange of letters that legitimized the disengagement plan, an exchange of letters between Ariel Sharon and George Bush, in which George Bush signs off on the disengagement model by saying of the settlement blocks, such as Ariel, which cuts right across the West Bank, as I said, or Alfie Menashe that you just saw, that the blocks, quote, according to Bush, in light of the new realities on the ground, including already existing major Israeli population centers, it's unrealistic to expect that the outcome of final status negotiations will be a full and complete return to the armistice lines of 1949. So that is what you have. You have the United States backing for that, as I said, 405 to 7 in the House, 95 to 5 in the Senate, for the redrawing of the peace process, which had been articulated in international law repeatedly previously. That had been completely thrown out the window with the disengagement plan. And as Doug Weisglass said, it takes the peace process, the core issues of the peace process, Jerusalem, the borders, the refugees, and the settlements, and it puts it in formaldehyde. It puts it for 25 years, as the term that Doug Weisglass says, is to park conveniently for 25 years to further develop these facts on the ground, to further develop facts on the ground that will make a peace process impossible or anything but these ghettos that Israel needs to establish. The reason for the ghettos is that the two-state solution, as it's framed, as it's concocted in the eyes of the Israelis and American administration, in the eyes of Hillary Clinton, the two-state solution is an imperative for Israel. And this is what Elmer is saying when he says we need to avoid the South African situation. We need to avoid one person, one vote. We need to avoid democracy within the area of Israel and Palestine, lest the Jewish supreme rights be undermined through a program of democracy. So that's those are crucial elements to understand with the siege. That the siege takes place within the context of the freezing of the peace process. The freezing of the peace process, which Tzipi Livni said when she visited the National Press Club during this last brutal invasion, she said that the invasion doesn't undermine the peace process, it facilitates the peace process. So these things don't take place because of rocket fire in this circumstance, or suicide bombings, or infiltrators if we go back to the 1950s. It takes place within the context of what Israel sees as a two-state solution and what Israel sees as the peace process. You can see the wall, the way the wall is built within the West Bank, looking identical to the way that it looks in Gaza, in this case right down the side of a street, dividing Palestinians, as many of you know, not from Israel, but from Palestinians, from other Palestinian villages. Now, the Palestinian resistance and Palestinian response to this is what these next series of pictures will show, and I think the context of how Palestinians deal with the siege and is something that, as a guy growing up in Toronto and going to visit Gaza or the West Bank, is something that is always inspiring to me, because although we come back here to North America and we're told that it's controversial what's happening, when you see the way that the children react to their circumstances and the lucidity with which they approach their circumstances, you realize that this is the next generation. And if the ghettoization of the Palestinians is the next generation of the conflict, these kids are growing up within that context, and what they're seeing in Gaza, they understand is not the past, but it's in fact the future. And so we want to understand that crucially when we move forward in seeing that the siege on Gaza and the attack on Gaza that we saw on our television screens was not something that that ended, was not an end game strategy, but in fact it's the beginning of the new paradigm. On the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the occupation of Jerusalem, Ehud Olmert described and amplified what it is that we're discussing, the entrenching of this regime, when he said, quote, "The last 40 years were only the beginning. I believe, I hope, and I pray that we will continue to work together to reinforce Jerusalem and extend its boundaries." So I want to leave you with that note, that this is the beginning of the next element of the conflict, to create a series of Gaza strips in the West Bank.